Hey, John, I think we're on.
Hi, Glenn. Good to
Hey,
be.
good to have you, Glenn Loury at the Glenn Show, bloggingheads.tv. I also, from time to time, hold class at Columbia University. I'm
Hmm.
here with John I hold class at Brown University is what I meant to say, but I'm here with John McWhorter, who was on the faculty at Columbia University. We are Glenn and John at the Blogging Heads site, and we're here to talk about politics and culture and race in America today. John, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Glenn.
Always a pleasure. Let's see, what do we got?
You know what we can kick off with? This is something I have thought about writing about, but
Yeah.
I don't think I'm going to bother. Let's just talk about something. Did you read Ross Douthat's column about a week ago in the Times,
Yeah.
where he was making a modest proposal, so to speak, that reparations be granted? And he's doing this series of modest proposal columns where he floats something that he knows will never happen. And he was saying, well, why don't we have some sort of reparations for slavery? And he's, being respectful to people like Ta-Nehisi Coates and saying, okay, let's try it as part of being a truly progressive Republican. And you know what I was thinking? And I want to see if you can follow me on this,
Okay.
because I've often said I'm not against reparations. I think that they already happen. I think
John,
that
excuse me for interrupting. Why don't we tell people what the proposal that Doubt had made was before we discuss it?
you
You
tell
want to
them
do
that.
that? Well, what he says is we've had a long-standing debate going on in the country about both affirmative action and reparations. And here's my Swiftian modest proposal. How about this? We do a deal. We'll do the reparations for black people, but we'll back the affirmative action.
Mm-hmm.
That was his proposal. Get rid of affirmative action. In exchange for that, pay out the reparations. So we'll pacify the reparations demanders, but we'll relieve the country of what he, I think, believes to be an inappropriate or a burdensome policy, namely
Yeah.
affirmative action.
And of course, the immediate response to the column one might have is, depending on what side of things you're on, no, you can't get rid of affirmative action, so just forget it. But I found myself thinking, let's imagine that reparations were granted in that way. Let's imagine that we got past the whole idea of how do you define who is black, et cetera, and some metric was developed, probably with a rather free definition of what black is, but everybody gets a certain amount of money. It's interesting. I wonder, I'm thinking, I could get behind that. I've always said no reparations because they already happen in terms of so very many policies such as affirmative action. I've always said it's not that reparations weren't granted. But let's say we did a second wave of reparations. Everybody gets maybe $10,000 or something like that. I wonder if I could get behind that if the idea could be that as of that, the idea was that the debt had been paid and that another shoe did not have yet to drop. I get the feeling that if those reparations were granted and poor black families got $10,000 and maybe even various other benefits and arrangements, that a lot of people would say they better not think that they can treat us like animals for 400 years and then just pay us off. Some other people would say reparations are not the end, they're just the beginning. And I think if that's what would come out of it, there'd be no point in even giving out the checks. I would say, everybody, Black America, we're going to give out these checks, and then it's the beginning of a new time when we have to change our language and our perspective. But no checks if they can only be granted under the conditions of people saying, no, this is just the beginning. Could you get behind it if the idea was, here's your check, and yeah, now affirmative action is over. We did it for 3 generations, and now it's over. And no more of the race thing being something considered so complicated. It's really a religion, and what it really means is that black people can't be subjected to normal standards. All of that is over. We start again. We pay the debt. Would you get behind it if it could be accepted in that way?
Well, no, because I don't think it can be accepted in that way. That is to say, I don't think the commitment, we're going to do this, but this is it, is credible. I think that it's a little bit like the amnesty debate with respect to immigration, where, of course, one wants to deal sympathetically with individuals who happen to be here without authorization, who've been here for a while, who are contributing members of the society. And so you declare, well, okay, we're going to legalize them, just this one time. We're going to regularize their status. But going forward, anybody who comes in who doesn't have authorization is not going to be eligible. And then 10, 15, 20, 25 years go by, and another 10, 12 million people who are here are unauthorized, and we're back at square one. And my feeling about paying of reparations as a response to the disadvantaged status of African Americans is that to the extent that that disadvantaged status persists going forward, the fact of having paid at some point in the past won't outweigh the compelling moral argument that the country needs yet to grapple with the consequences of its history, that the inadequacy of the initial payment, whatever that number might be, should it prove that black disadvantage persists in another generation or two, the inadequacy of that original payment will be decried, and the country will be called back to a reckoning. So, I don't think that that's a way out. I mean, if the hypothetical that you posit, one-time payment, and it's behind us, we're going to stick with it, everybody believes it, it's a credible commitment, were possible, perhaps, I'd be perhaps willing to entertain Ross Doubthead's
So wait, are you saying that because a lot of the problems that we're dealing with are culturally passed on in a fabric, that money alone wouldn't help and therefore we would be just back where we started? Or are you saying that the country must grapple? You use that word grapple. What do you mean grapple?
No, I'm saying people will say the country must grapple. I haven't spoken for myself yet.
Okay.
I am saying that the problems are rooted in such a way. I wouldn't want only to say cultural. They are also material. They have a long, history has a long shadow, but they're so deeply rooted that a cash transfer intervention is quite possibly not going to reverse some of the problems. I'm talking about academic underperformance. I'm talking about family disorganization. I'm talking about disproportionate participation in criminal activity. And I'm talking about other manifestations of the stunted social development of the African American population, or at least portions of it in the United States here in the 21st century, large inner city ghettos and so forth, problems like the problem of violence and gang activity and guns and so forth in cities like Chicago and elsewhere. It's hard for me to imagine a cash transfer program reversing those problems. Now, those problems need to be grappled with, in my opinion, but I would argue, and this is a somewhat separate argument, that those problems need to be grappled with everywhere that Americans are disadvantaged, including white communities and Hispanic communities and others, and they need to be grappled with as an expression of the country's ethical commitments, moral decency, social conscience as to what kind of people we want to be. We should have education policy that fosters the development of our youth. We should have criminal justice policies that are not overly punitive and disproportionately, oppressive of disadvantaged people who may get involved in crime. We can talk about healthcare policy for a country, and all of those things should be undertaken, in my view, out of a kind of universal humanist sensibility, not out of a racial repair sensibility. The problem I had with the modest proposal is that I think both sides of the deal are problematic. I mean, he wants to trade the payment of reparations for getting rid of affirmative action. I think the problem with affirmative action is a problem with affirmative action. I mean, it should be opposed to the extent that we believe that there's a problem. And I do think there's a deep problem with affirmative action. And that problem, I'll just go on for one more minute, is not mainly that whites are discriminated against by a policy that favors non-whites, but it's that the use of a special dispensation for African American and other people, young people applying to college and so forth, into the 21st century becoming institutionalized as a permanent way of doing business in our society is profoundly unequal. I mean, there's no equality in affirmative action. If by affirmative action we mean the application of different standards of assessment in light of the fact that people belong to disadvantaged population groups, doing business in that way as a permanent feature of American society is in effect declaring there's no prospect that African Americans are ever going to be genuinely equal citizens in the society, and we lock in a kind of favoritism based upon our regret of a morally problematic past. And I think it begs the question of what needs to be done in order to actually transform the capacities, the functioning, the status of development, the performance, the achievement in the disadvantaged population so that they are in fact equal. I don't see how you can be equal and also be patronized, be the subject of a special dispensation. There's no equality in that. So my objections to affirmative action are at that level, and I don't see why I have to trade another bad policy. The racialization, the monetization, in my view, that's not the way to deal with this history that we have. We need to get the racial issues behind us. We need to outgrow our 20th century way of thinking about this problem in terms of intrinsic bias, inveterate white supremacist sort of cast to the society. I think we need to move beyond that, and I didn't think Douthat's proposal would take us very far in that direction of moving beyond that.
Well, everything you just said about affirmative action is so eminently reasonable, and yet everything you just said about affirmative action would be received by many people as plutonium. And by many people who run universities, very Pacific-minded people, what you said elicits the response, yeah, those are things to think about, kind of looking over your shoulder, with the idea being, but not to think about too much, and really we're supposed to just keep doing things the way we were. That is beautiful evidence of what's being discussed a lot this week. And I don't want to move on to this necessarily, but the idea that things are thought of in religious terms. The idea is that you simply are not allowed to ask too many questions. And so William Deresiewicz and Andrew Sullivan have taken up the banner of saying that a lot of the way we think about social justice these days has become more a matter of religious faith than reasoning. Because certainly what you're saying about affirmative action is at least up for debate. And yet to talk to Dean X, Y, or Z about these sorts of things is like asking a priest why God does things that hurt people. And, of course, there are various half answers can be given, and you're not supposed to ask any questions after that. But the thing about reparations is that I think many people would also say that racism is ingrained in society in the institutional or societal fashion, such that payments could only possibly be a beginning, because what we really need to reform is society itself. And if society itself needs to be reformed, and if it seems highly unlikely that society is going to change in that way anytime soon, then inherently it means that any question of payments granted to people, if the society is so polluted, if the society has the deck stacked so much against poor people of whatever color, then payments shouldn't even be on the table. The idea of there being reparations in that way doesn't make any logical sense. You would think that people would say, no, we need to think about dismantling these structures in society. The very fact that there can even be a discussion about or around reparational payments, again, is religious. Because why it compels is because it pays into this narrative of black people as always owed, as in O-W-E-D. The idea is that black people must be the poster children, and therefore that's an interesting topic, even if it doesn't technically make sense. So, Jesus loves you, and yet look at the world. That doesn't make any sense, but you're not supposed to talk about it. In the same way, society is set against the success of any poor black family. And yet, we need to have reparations because black people are owed, because that would help change things. And people would say, well, no, it would be only a beginning. But a beginning of what? And would it actually be any different from the people not having been given the money and society having been changed? Well, no, you're not supposed to talk about it this much. This is too lawyerly. You're not part of the program. That's how all this sort of thing gets discussed.
Well, a couple of reactions. I mean, one on the religious question. I do agree with you and Deresiewicz and Andrew Sullivan, and Shelby Steele also had a piece in the Wall Street Journal last week. You've been saying this for quite a long time, that there's something about liberal racial attitudes that are sort of beyond reason, that they're not really about arguments or about policy. They're about the demonstration of a certain, sort of stance vis-a-vis the zeitgeist of a certain orientation or identity or set of commitments that could be analogized to religion. I don't much like your Jesus loves me, but look at the world. That doesn't make any sense, because as a person who spent quite a bit of time as an observant Christian in my adult life, although I'm not still carrying on the same religious practice now, which is a subject for another discussion, I do think it's a little bit more complicated. I mean, Jesus can love you and the world can be a mess. Those things are not necessarily inconsistent. Jesus' love for you doesn't say that everything's going to be a rose petal strewn pathway through the forest. There are going to be challenges. But let me leave that. I want to talk about reparations, because I think, it's odd in a way. It's a kind of the commodification of African American suffering, of disadvantage, of history, the commodification of it, the converting of it into, a coin, the demand for a quid pro quo, the monetization. See, I think this is a mistake. I not only because who's black, who's due payment, not only because where's the money going to come from? We're taxing society in general and so forth. Not only because the causal chain by which recipients' disadvantage is said to be the consequence of wrongful historical acts is far from being straightforward. I just came from a conference on the life and times of Frederick Douglass, and we delved deeply into some of his writings. And I can tell you that in the decades after the Civil War, when the vast majority of African Americans were rural peasants in a hostile South, landless, sharecroppers, unable to exercise their rights, their formal rights that had been granted by the Reconstruction Amendments, terrorized, shunted to the margin, there was very ample argument for, quote, reparations, close quote, which I think should have been land reform. That is, not only confiscating the property in person of the slave-owning class by liberating the slaves, but also confiscating some of their land by ensuring that the liberated slaves would not be dependent upon local lords, in effect, who had control over the essential means of production and could reduce them and maintain them in impunity. Exactly. There was in my mind, a very clear argument for reparation, but here we are now, 150 years later, okay, with everything that has gone by. And the kinds of arguments that people are making, which latch on to this history and then assert, the gangbangers are running rampant in Chicago, or the school dropout rates are what they are, or the out-of-wedlock birth rate is what it is, or the SAT scores are what they are, or the number of people who are penetrating top management at this company or in that industry is what it is, because of, and then there's some gesture at some generic historical violation based upon race. I think it's very poor philosophy, it's very poor social historical analysis, and it's very poor politics. These are problems, in my view, which are best confronted through ordinary political agitation and engagement of interested transracial coalitions who can shape the society, the policies, the government, healthcare policy, education policy, and so forth, in ways that are beneficial to disadvantaged people broadly. I don't know why we would want to cast this problem explicitly in racial terms. So I've talked too long, I think, but it's a relational issue, and the relationship is not between something called black people and something called white America. The relationship is amongst Americans, between those who have advantage and those and are able to pay taxes and contribute to, let's say, underwriting the costs of health care for an indigent family, and those who do not, regardless of their color. I don't get it why people get upset. They think it's a microaggression to
Yeah.
say we should move to a world where we hire the best qualified. They think it's a microaggression to observe that poverty is poverty, disadvantage is disadvantage, unemployment is unemployment, being locked in a cell is being locked in a cell. They think it's some kind of offense to observe that, yes, the laws are too punitive and the drug policy should be shifted, but who's responsible for the fact that people are out there breaking laws and being caught doing things that are harmful to their fellow citizens? There's supposed to be a racial dispensation in virtue of that. So I just think there's a kind of deep moral confusion, and it fits into your religion, and I'll stop, in the sense that it becomes a trope, right? It becomes a way of a person's affirmation of these policies of repair and redress, which I am questioning, becomes a way in which they can exhibit their bona fides. They can demonstrate that they're on the right side of history. These university administrators that you're talking about are not concerned by the fact that when you go to the engineering building or the science building at a place like Brown, you see a ton of Asians and you almost don't see any black people in those buildings because they've got 8% of their entering class being black. They've checked that box. They've quelled the complaint that the place is not diverse. And yet the performance differences which manifest themselves in phenomena such as I just described, go to a calculus class and look who's sitting there. Just go and look. Okay? Look at who's majoring in astrophysics. Look at who's majoring in chemistry. Look at who's majoring in electrical engineering. Look, just take a look. Okay? Look at who's getting PhDs from the best institutions in the country. Okay? The obvious glaring underrepresentation of African Americans in those venues can be papered over by saying, well, we're a diverse place because our head count gives us this or gives us that. They have no investment in equality. That's not equality for my people. That's a patronizing dispensation for my people that has an excuse at every turn for why our performance doesn't measure up. And I think we have to address the problem of development in a serious way, and not just for black people, but for all Americans. That's my story. I'm sticking with it.
The sad thing is that the very administrators you're talking about are regularly assailed as being bigots and racists by the very student bodies who they're trying to diversify. There's an incoherence to the conversation. And I want to run something by you, and I wonder if you've gotten to this same place. It's kind of a disease that's hit me over the past couple years, and I'm beginning to worry about myself. And since I call myself some kind of race commentator, I'm slipping in that. I didn't know that this was the beginning of something, but when you and I first started, and audience, this is not going to devolve into another session of bashing on poor Ta-Nehisi Coates, but when we first talked about Ta-Nehisi Coates and his Between the World and Me, and I said that I hadn't read it and that I wasn't going to read it, and I meant it. I'm not going to read it because I felt at the time, I know the drill, life is short, I've got 2 kids, I have other books to read, and I'm not going to devote the energy to listening to something where I know how the song goes. And that felt fine. But Glenn, I'm scared to death that I'm now doing that with a lot of race books. I used to try to either read everything that was important or read it. There's a kind of
I know.
And I used to feel like, wow, I don't want to get caught short, and I'm really interested in what everybody's saying. Both of those things. Don't want to get caught, and I'm really interested. But it's at the point where I'm seeing books written about, and I'm just thinking, no, and it's not because I dislike the people. It's not that I'm just deciding they're crazy or something like that, but I'm thinking, I know the drill, and it really is, it occupies the same place in my mind. And I'm sorry about how anti-religious I sound, but I'm an atheist. I look at those books and I say, that's a religious book. I think that is a book of liturgy, that's catechism, and I don't feel like reading something that is not going to try to make logical sense. And I'm not even going to name the books that I haven't been reading, but Glenn, it's extending to films. I'm embarrassed. Like, for example, and I might be wrong about this new movie, Get Out, in which we have Jordan Peele of the wonderful comedy team Key and Peele has directed this movie about, it's about a black man who is involved, a young black man who's involved with a white woman, attractive white woman, played by Girls' Allison Williams. And it's also a horror movie, and it's a little tongue-in-cheek, and it's interesting, and everybody's telling me it's so deep, and I've just got to see it. Now, from sniffing around it, I can tell, and I'm giving audience, this is what I know. It's not only a comedy that is a modern Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, but something is going on a horror level involving it becoming clear that the family of this girl are doing something dire to black men out of an impulse of not caring about black people, and nobody cares. And so there's an underlying message in Get Out about the racism roiling underneath in America, rather like the movie Crash from 2005, which had that kind of message in a different way. I haven't seen Get Out, and I haven't hit the button on Netflix to see it either, because I'm thinking I'm going to be sitting here trying to enjoy the performances, and then this movie is going to exaggerate and tell me that American life is all about racism, basically because Tamir Rice was unjustly killed. And Glenn, I'm at the point, I don't want to hear it.
Yeah, I hear you.
And I feel guilty because I feel like I'm ignoring things that people put a lot of work into, and it might be better than I think. But I'm not reading the books, and I am skipping the movies. I have not seen Ava DuVernay's 13. And I don't... 13th?
Yes, for 13th. And in reference to the 13th Amendment.
Well, I've seen that documentary.
Let me say,
do you have any feelings?
I have seen the 13th, and I'll tell you what I think about it. I've also seen Selma, and I think we discussed that years ago in a past
Selma
conversation. Same director, Ava DuVernay. Regarding people not read and not addressed, you mentioned Ta-Nehisi Coates. We're not supposed to mention him here. The audience gets upset, at least some elements of the audience, because they think we're obsessed with Mr. Coates, and they think we're jealous of his... And what?
They're not... Yeah.
I'm sorry, repeat it, John. I had a glitch. They're not...
And they're not completely wrong. I think we have overdone it.
Okay, we may have overdone it, and we won't go on any further now, except that the brother is not beyond criticism, and as far as I'm concerned, he's a lightweight, okay? I mean, let me just say it again. He's not a serious commentator on contemporary social matters, okay, all right? And that's my view. I'm not backing away from that. And it's not because, I want to be him or anything close to him. I mean, quite the contrary. Okay, I want to be the Merton Stokes Professor of the Social Sciences at Brown University with a 40-year accomplishment of academic achievement. Not the flavor of the month product. Okay, so I'll stop. But again, to those who are about to chastise me for taking time to criticize Ta-Nehisi Coates, he's not beyond criticism. Okay, but be that as it may, the attitude that you evince, namely, I'm tired of reading this predictable nonsense, and I got better things to do with my time, is one that, believe me, I can definitely relate to. I sat through the 13th. Okay, this is Ava DuVernay's documentary film about mass incarceration. It's called the 13th because the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Oh, by the way, that was the one that emancipated the slaves. I just came from this conference with Frederick Douglass. I've been around for a while. I know a little bit about American history, but I was just stunned by the power of the political earthquake that is going on in the United States in the 1850s, leading up to the Civil War, and the momentous world historic character of what unfolds out of those events, namely the elimination of the Southern slaveholders' property entitlement in persons and the emancipation of, 3 or 4 million Africans who are being held in bondage. I mean, it's a stunning and it's an amazing thing. So the 13th Amendment to the Constitution affects in constitutional law the end of involuntary servitude. It includes an exception. The exception says, except for people who are being held in prison, in so many words, for having committed crimes, involuntary servitude shall be inconsistent with the laws of the United States of America. Now, the premise of this documentary film is that exception clause kind of takes back with the left hand what had been given with the right. They said they were emancipating the slaves, but they left this exception for incarcerating people. Look at mass incarceration in the United States today and look at the history of it. It's just a ruse. It's a device for continuing the enslavement of African Americans by another name. So goes this argument. And that argument is supposed to apply in the year 2013 or 15 or whenever it was that the film was produced, every bit as much as it applied in 1980, as it applied in 1950, as it applied in 1920, as it applied in 1890. And I came away feeling like I had been exposed to a very artfully rendered, very sort of nicely high production values and cleverly wrought, a piece of propaganda on behalf of what I thought was a kind of implausible proposition in the first place. Really? The framers of the 13th Amendment of the Constitution, after 620,000 Americans were slaughtered in a horrific war, and the whole world was turned upside down in terms of the political economy of the United States. Really? The framers of that amendment had in mind that they wanted to continue slavery by another name? They were going to use the prison system to enslave black people? The idea that imprisonment today is the equivalent of slavery is a profound insult to slaves.
Mm-hmm.
You go out with a pistol, you blow somebody's brains out, or you rob them of their property, or you beat them within an inch of their life, or you rape them, and you find yourself confined, and I'm supposed to think about your condition as the modern-day equivalent of slavery. Why? Because of the racial disproportion in the population of people who are subject to this confinement?
Well, Glenn, don't forget also that the conditions of your neighborhood condemned you to have to kill people in order to survive.
That's a separate argument, and I would, of course, reject that argument as robbing people of the responsibility for their personal agency and so forth, notwithstanding the fact that I understand environmental conditions need to be taken into account. We need to address them through decent social policy, promulgated on behalf of people, not as members of racial aggregates. This is my view. I repeat myself. But this idea that I'm not going to spend time reading Michael Eric Dyson's latest open letter to white people. I'm not going to spend my time going into the movie theater and watching propagandistic films by wealthy cultural mandarins who exploit their access to the media in order to propagate slogans. I'm quite sympathetic to the idea that life is short. I'm in my late 60s. I'm not going to live forever. And I'll be damned if I dissipate my substance by arguing with people about trivia. I'm long past it. And to be accused of not caring about African Americans because I don't want to enter into this sophistic, sophomoric cul-de-sac that people seem content to reside in, it infuriates me. I don't care about black people.
Yeah,
quite the contrary.
What irritates me is that, let's say, yes, there is subliminal racism. Yes, if you analyze 15 minutes of conversation in an Upper West Side living room between white and black people, you can find intersectional things where race and racism may have infected the way somebody puts something or assumptions somebody makes. Yes, those things are there. And so to counter the possible objection that I'm saying I don't want to see a movie that tells us that racism lies beneath the surface when, dummy, don't you understand that it does? Yeah, but I don't quite get, I do get why we stress it so much when it's something that probably there's no real solution for. And more to the point, we stress it so much. We stress it the way religious people stress issues like religious faith. And the reason that it's stressed is because of an underlying assumption that all of those subtle attitudes must add up and be why, for example, poor black people are poor. And what's interesting to me is that there isn't much evidence of that. Another way of looking at it is that people could thrive and survive despite all of this underlying bullshit. And that seems to have been what an awful lot of other people do, including dark-skinned immigrants to this country. There was implicit association tests are famous these days, especially over the past 10 years, for showing that white people who think of themselves as not racist, educated often, find that on a test, they're more ready to associate negative concepts with black faces. And so the idea is that that shows underlying racist bias. Now, for 10 years, it's been said that tests like that show the rot lying underneath the surface. But we get so excited about those tests because we think, well, that must be, when you combine all those attitudes, why black families stay poor. That's institutional racism that's measured with electrodes. But the truth is, there's a wonderful article in an issue of New York Magazine from early January this year that shows that if you look at all of the implicit association test studies, none of them show, if you look at all the evidence, that those biases translate into anything that people do in real life, and that as often as not, people who score badly on those tests in real life actually treat black people better, possibly because of overcompensation, but still. So there's no evidence that those biases that you can find in an artificial test putting somebody are responsible for why black housing projects are the way they are responsible why there are X percent fewer Ys who are black than white, etc. There's no evidence for that. And yet we obsess over those things, over this racism subtly lying underneath the surface, because of an idea that, well, that explains it all. But it doesn't. There's no evidence that it explains it all. And even if there weren't evidence showing that it doesn't explain it all, it's counterintuitive. Because throughout world history, human groups have managed to succeed despite all of this underlying rot in people's attitudes. And we're told that somehow it's different for descendants of African slaves in one country, the United States, that somehow we are a special case. I've never seen anybody explain why Black America post about 1965 is somehow a special case, different from that of everybody else. And it doesn't work to say it's dark skin, because look at African immigrants who come here. The answer is supposedly that they had immigrant pluck, in which case still I ask, what is it about native-born black Americans here that is different in terms of all of these prospects for success? And I think it's just that the ideology ends up discouraging people or distracting people from the very notion that you get ahead amidst imperfect conditions. And that's what I think we're stuck in.
Okay, here's a simple question for you, John, by way of pushing back. So persistent African-American disadvantage into the 21st century, a half-century past the Civil Rights Movement. Well, we do have to have some explanation for it. If you don't buy racism as an explanation for it, then the problem must be with us. As one of my students asked me in a course I was teaching on racial inequality recently, after I'd given a lecture not dissimilar from the kind of stuff that you can find me saying with you here at Blogging Heads, the kid comes up and says, Professor Loury, do you think there's something wrong with black people? And I said, no, there's nothing wrong with black people. At least nothing wrong that persistent self-application, hard work and
why didn't he have in class?
And discipline. He's black.
Okay.
Second generation Nigerian Igbo.
I knew immediately he was African, and I'm not surprised he's Igbo. Okay.
Those are anyway. Let me not generalize. But I think I know where you're going with that, because there is a discernible difference actually in the attitude of some of my second generation African American students. But he says, do you think there's something wrong with black people? I said, no, man, I don't think there's anything, quote, wrong with black people, close quote. I mean, I think there's some stuff that's messed up, but I don't think it's intrinsic. I think it needs to be addressed. I think it can be addressed. We got to raise our kids. We got to put our nose to the grindstone. We got to develop our capacities, our human capacities, which I posit, if I can't demonstrate it, it's a working axiom for me, are no different on the whole than those of any other population group. But the ball's kind of in our court now, and that's what I'm saying. There's not anything wrong with it. But for a lot of people, you have a choice. Either there's something wrong with the system, or there's something wrong with our people. And that latter is just an unpalatable, unacceptable posture to take. So it must be that there's something wrong with the system, one way or the other. It must be that the reason that the murder rate is so high in Chicago is that it's something wrong with the system. It's the fact that the drugs are illegal. It's the fact that the jobs, the unemployment rate is too high. It's the fact that we won't invest in education. It's the fact that residential neighborhoods are racially segregated. That accounts for the, quote, carnage, close quote, that we see unfolding in places like Chicago. anything but that the behavior of our adolescents is destructive and inhibits the ability of others to function, and is a result of the inadequate socialization and development of those people, for which family and community are substantially responsible, as well as the social structures like educational institutions and social policy. Anything but laying responsibility for failure at the feet of people who have failed. And it's hard. It's hard to say failure in reference to a population of persons who have been historically maltreated. But I don't think it does anybody any good to make up, these fairy tales about the long shadow of slavery into the 21st century, accounting for a kid on the street at 1 o'clock in the morning at the age of 16, high on PCP, staggering down the middle of the street with a pistol tucked under his belt.
You know, it's interesting. I've had another change of heart these days because, I don't think that the black community has failed. I think that the black community has been failed by a way of looking at things that settled in among the leading classes and the leading thinkers about 50 years ago, which said that black people are an exception, that you cannot apply the standards you apply to everybody else to black people ever because of what happened in the past. And that way of thinking is something that Philip Randolph and Frederick Douglass would never have understood. Not even King would have. I love the thought experiment of what would Martin Luther King think now? And anybody who thinks that he would think exactly what, to take somebody at random, Michael Eric Dyson thinks, I think are not really reading King the way he actually was. But, Glenn, you see things in New York, and these are just anecdotes, but, everybody thinks anecdotes are great when it comes to cop shootings. And so I think there's value in some anecdotes. You ride the subway in New York. I've been riding the subway a lot in this city for 15 years now. And people of all different colors and classes live here, including lower class white people. A lot of people here. And there's certain things that you see on the subway which 98.5% of the time are done by black people. So are white girls about 20-something who've been drinking too much on a Friday or Saturday night sometimes a little loud? Yeah, but they are never as loud as black school kids at 3 o'clock. I mean, it seems like they're almost working at it. And no, there are white school kids. You see them too. None of them act like the black kids. Or just the other day, I was on my way back to Queens. A woman, black woman, single mom with her child is playing the kind of music that's got lots of cussing and sex in it. Now, never mind that the child is listening to this, but she's playing it at ear-shattering volume in a crowded train car. She's not crazy. She's just obnoxious. Anybody who asks her to turn it down, she says, I don't know what you're talking about, and keeps it on. Everybody in the car is glaring at her. She's almost enjoying it. Now, you know what? The reason that she thought of this as reasonable, and frankly, in New York City, I've never seen a white person do anything like that. That's something that you expect, I hate to say it, from a black girl. I hate to say it, but even though I hate to say it, it's true. And 15 years is long enough. She thinks that she's not subject to general standards of evaluation. Now, nobody told her that in so many words, but in the culture she grew up in, she thinks anybody who tells me I can't do this, well, there's an extent of racism to it. I can do what I want because my people are oppressed and my brother got picked up by the police. I'm going to do what I want. And the hard thing about all this is that it's not as if she's thinking it consciously. It's not as if you would get that out of her if you put a microphone in her face. But it's the only possible explanation for such egregious behavior from such people. The standards are different for us. It's so ingrained in the community, and you see it in people as young as 8 years old, that I've become in favor of this idea of moving poor black people into white communities. I used to say no, keep poor, so that poor black people can live together. And
so as to do what? To disrupt the cultural reinforcement of certain unproductive attitudes?
Yes, because I don't see what else could break that cycle.
So
And
you
I
know what
feel bad.
somebody is going to say here, John? They're going to say, yeah, she's sullen. She's contemptuous of civil norm about the kind of behavior that we expect from one another in public places. And she has good reason to. That's the bitter fruit of a life of exclusion
Right,
and marginalization. And by the
right.
way, her mother and father experienced similarly, and the generation before them, and so on. And it's the definition of blaming the victim to take
Yep.
somebody who's got a chip on their shoulder because they've been being shat upon by life
Hmm.
because of their skin color, and then to blame them for having a bad attitude.
Right.
They didn't get
But
out of the wrong side of the bed this morning. The bed fell on them this morning, or whatever the right metaphor is, and they got a right to be angry. Just like
and
some
you
of
know,
these lawbreakers, these young men who the cops
right.
might be talking of in similar tones to the ones that you used just now to describe this woman on the bus train. You might say, the cop might say, when I encounter these young men, they're all shiftless, they ain't up to any good, they all got contraband, they're all dangerous, they're all impolite and rude and uncooperative, and of course I approach them with my backup. I need to out of self-preservation. I haven't
Right.
encountered a good one yet. And, maybe these kids are exhibiting the attitude that they're exhibiting because of the lives that they've had to live for which they're not responsible.
And you know what?
How would
The
you respond to
problem
that?
with the problem is, I don't think that that's always the case anymore. I mean, for example, yes, if life has shit upon you, I understand how you might go out in public and show your behind, as my mother used to put it. I completely get that. What worries me is that I don't think in 2017 that life has necessarily shit on that girl. Because the way culture works is that you speak the language that's around you, you take on the attitudes and the demeanors that you see around you. And it could be that a seed is planted by conditions that make men behave a certain way, that make women behave a certain way. But then, even if the conditions are withdrawn, there's certain cultural mores that may stay in place because there's no reason necessarily to withdraw them. And that might translate into, for example, attitude in public. So let's say that her grandmother was, a maid or something like that, or really, got, trampled by life in ways that
Yeah,
most black people can be thankful that they weren't.
yeah,
Then her grandmother has her mother, and her mother led a different kind of life. The mother acts a certain way. Her daughter grows up watching that kind of attitudes, that
yeah.
way of talking to people, that way of smacking kids, and just does it because that's what she saw. I suspect that that girl is that, and we both know that a lot of those boys are that. They're doing what their brother did, and their brother was doing what their cousin did. It's not that the world shits on them, it's that that's the only male role model they've seen. It's not their fault. But how do you break it? I'm beginning to think that a little bit of good old fashioned integration really is the only possible solution because you drink this stuff in from toddlerhood. It's nobody's fault.
So what about an army of concerned people like yourself and myself, and they don't have to be black? They could be retired military officers or enlisted personnel. They could be elders who have a lot of time on their hands and want to be constructive contributors to their community. They could be youngsters who are children of privilege and who want to spend a couple of 3 years doing service to their country and whatnot. They could be church congregations motivated out of some kind of spiritual commitment, and they don't have to be Christian, by the way. They could be mosques and synagogues in the mix here. They don't have to be all black. They shouldn't be all black. The subjects of their ministrations need not only be in disadvantaged African Americans. They could be disadvantaged people more broadly. They could be big brothers and big sisters. They could be working at drug rehabilitation clinics, or they could be tutors for intensive programs at charter schools that, run on past the end of the school day. They could be peer advisors who are standing on the street corner at 11 o'clock at night or 1 o'clock in the morning trying to engage with these kids and trying to talk to them about, in Chicago, there's a Lake Michigan. It's actually only 4 miles east of where you're standing right now. You've never seen it, have you? Come on, let me take you down there. We're going to stroll through the Art Institute, not to lecture you about Renoir or Degas, but simply to give you a sense of what happens inside that building. Check the architecture out. Check out that stuff that's hanging on the wall. What do you think about that? I mean, let's, it's not a test, but, anyway. Long and short of it, what about relationships? And I'm not talking about government, although government could have a role here in underwriting some of the cost and facilitating some of the coordination. But building of relationships. If you put people in white communities, yeah, you get them away from what might be negative self-reinforcing influences, but you don't necessarily fill the gap of a stressed out single mom who's only got 24 hours in a day and trying to keep after 4 kids, keep them fed and everything like that. You don't necessarily, cancel out the deleterious influence of a gang leader who's the big man and on the block, and all the other kids want to look up to him because he's been away for a couple of years and come back with tattoos and with big muscles and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. In fact, the Move to Opportunity experiment, the big experiment that studied the effects of subsidizing geographic relocation within urban areas of disadvantaged families by giving them vouchers so they could afford an apartment in another neighborhood.
The experiment, right? Yeah.
Found, amongst other things, that for many of the people who did move, some of the negative effects were still going to be present because the relation. Yeah, they brought it with them. I mean, you take somebody out of the ghetto, as it were, but you don't take the quote ghetto out of the person, unquote. Again, as it were. The challenge to us of developing the capacities of people, it seems to me, is a much greater challenge than the challenge either of looking the other way at their lack of development or of throwing them a bone. Okay? It requires actual relationship. It can't be, that's, again, my problem with reparations. You write a check and we're done. It doesn't address relationship. It doesn't address the connections between people that are essential to facilitating human development and which need to be significantly enhanced for our most disadvantaged citizens. And again, I stress not only blacks.
It's definitely, although you have to get people, I mean, this has all been said before, but you've got to get people at a young age. Because, for example, this person, I'm going to put her at 29.
Yeah.
And at this point, anybody from outside of her little circle who came near, I don't want this bitch telling me what to do. She's unreachable. And because of her attitude, I think it's highly unlikely that she will ever have anything more than very mundane employment, and more to the point, she has this little girl. And the little girl was probably 3, already understands language. Yeah. Another 2 or 3 years with that mother and maybe a friend who acts like that. And that girl is the same person. Yeah. And so really, I mean, you move people out of the neighborhood, and yes, I used to think it doesn't seem to do any good to move people away. But it seems that educationally, at least, there are gains as long as people are moved young. So the younger the person is, the less likely they are to get into the cycle of failure in school. And I'm just thinking of it because, and this girl, I'm just using her as a kind of an icon of a general sense of self-perception among disadvantaged black people that seems quite different from that self-perception among a lot of Latino people, certainly Indian people, certainly West Indian and African people in this very diverse city. And you just wonder, how do you change what language these people are growing up hearing? And it gets frustrating. But Glenn, I've got to go.
Yeah, let me just say one thing quickly. I got to go too. I agree with you about the early intervention. I don't want to give up on the idea that people can chime in. I'm a guy that recovered from a significant cocaine addiction problem 25 years ago in my life. And believe me, it was very hard to stop using that drug. And the idea of change, so counseling and in the case of drug addiction treatment, where a person is through, significant structured intervention brought into a kind of recognition about what's the truth about their life. What are the excuses that they've been telling themselves? Why are they angry? How come they're always stepping in it and, having to dig themselves out of a hole and whatnot like that? I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. Let me just one day at a time put one foot in front of the other and see if I can't, whatever it is, keep this job, not lose my temper when I'm trying to deal with my kids, whatever. be aware of my own feelings and not let them rule over me. After all, they're just feelings. They're not facts. These are all little slogans that we have. I mean, I'm a believer that kind of thing can happen. Now, when we incarcerate somebody, that's the last thing that's going to happen, right? I mean, we could think about a different kind of social policy in which, even for mature adults, the way in which we engage with them, this would be paternalism for sure, was structured toward trying to transform the way in which they thought about themselves. My understanding is that a lot of social work types are not so positively inclined toward doing that because they think it's a kind of, who has the right to tell somebody else how to live, kind of thing.
Right. See?
Yeah. Anyway, we've made enough trouble here for ourselves, John, and we should probably call it a day and come back in a couple of 3 weeks and do it again.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks very much. I'm going to stop the recording.